Hey guys, Drifter here. Today, I'm going to try to summarize the key findings of the Mueller Report as factually as possible. I'll be doing this without personal bias and outside commentary and focusing on just the document itself. For those of you that are unfamiliar, this is the official findings of the FBI investigation into Russian election interference in 2016. This is also the document where the president is accused of working with Russia, popularly called collusion, and where the president is also accused of obstructing justice by attempting to curtail the investigation. It is an absolutely massive 448-page tome of lawyer speak that is not easy to understand. For reference, that's about the size of the first Game of Thrones book, and it reads kind of like a lawsuit and also has nearly 1,000 MLA-style citations. It's taken me several weeks to read through it and properly understand it and come up with format for this video. Based on my readings, not a single TV report, talk show, documentary, YouTube video, news interview, or online article that I've read so far has done this report justice. Most of the people that write these reports and make these videos kind of pick up on a few highly quotable lines and write a lot about those while ignoring everything else, including the important legal precedents of the document. That's why the best advice that I can give you today is that you shouldn't just trust me on this one. I think you should download and read this document yourself. Seriously, I've got it linked down there in the description. It's free. There's a searchable PDF. You can kind of read along with me, but no summary video, including this one, will be as good as reading the document itself. And the reason that I'm doing this is because the Mueller Report is one of the most important legal documents so far in this century because it will be the basis for determining whether or not our current president committed treason. It's the factual evidence for any attempted impeachment of the president. It also sets up a very complex constitutional battle that tests the separation of powers in the United States, and actions taken based on the findings of this report will likely set legal precedent for decades to come. I also feel that it's my ethical responsibility on this channel to keep my followers informed so that they're good, productive citizens, and that's why today I want to focus on just what the report says, because there's so much misinformation about what it does or does not say. I just want to make a really straightforward factual video that will be, of course, longer because it's not going to rely on short summaries. And I know that there are a lot of articles written about the validity of the report, how many Democrats were involved, what Mueller's motivations were, if the precedents were legal, etc., and these range from reasonable concerns all the way out to Pizzagate level conspiracy, and for the sake of my sanity, today's video will not address those. We're just going to focus on what the report itself says. So let's get started. Section 1 of the report talks about the Russian election interference in 2016 and any coordination they had with the Trump campaign. The first 65 pages or so of the report are just about Russian interference in the 2016 election and does not involve Trump or the Trump campaign in any capacity. It lays out several basic facts about Russian actions during the 2016 election. Number 1, as early as 2014, Russian agents began to plan a widespread misinformation campaign for the United States election. They even sent agents to the United States on tourist visas to take tons, hundreds, thousands of pictures for later use on fake accounts that would pretend to be Americans. The Internet Research Agency, aka the Troll Farm, aka the big office building where all the Russians that ran these sort of shell accounts and fake accounts and bot accounts, began a massive disinformation campaign starting in 2015. This misinformation campaign was primarily run through Facebook and Twitter, but also used YouTube and Reddit and just dozens of other internet forums and means of communication. It was primarily done through unofficial accounts that sorta kinda looked like or represented US organizations or claimed to be affiliated with them, and through individualized accounts that were designed to look like US citizens posting this information. And of course, there were tons of Russian bots and botnets too that helped boost how organic the content looked. The goal was to take any idea or belief held by any political party and take that to some level of extremity or absurdity that would make another group mad. Some examples would be the 10 GOP, which was the unofficial Tennessee GOP account that claimed to be associated with the Tennessee GOP and tweeted some let's say, unusual things. They created a fake Black Fist movement for arming black citizens in association with Black Lives Matter, and then would use the other accounts to share this with people on the other end of the spectrum to make it look like there were lots of black militants. They didn't really seem to care very much about what side this information was on or what it was for, as long as it was incendiary, as long as it could get left and right-wing people to fight each other. Later, during 2016 in the campaign, efforts were taken to support Trump and degrade Hillary Clinton. As the campaign continued, the Russian misinformation campaign began to favor Trump more and more, as they considered him to be the most divisive candidate, and they eventually also began to disparage Clinton more because Clinton was kind of anti-Russia at the time. Lots of politicians interacted and shared content from these accounts on both sides. Democrats, Republicans, Trump campaign staff members, I believe the president himself, regular citizens, tons and tons of people interacted with and shared this information with their friends, having no clue that it was fake or troll or Russian-oriented. The estimated reach was that 126 million Americans were exposed to IRA or Russian troll farm content in the 2016 election. Interestingly, they also hired American surrogates for their rallies, so if they wanted to have, say, a pro-Clinton rally in front of the Trump Tower, the person that was in charge of that organization or ran the Twitter account would be sick or unable to take off work, so they would offer a small amount of money to one of their biggest fans or to a local American to organize and run the rally for them. So there were also rallies in the United States that were organized by Russians, but the people on the ground were all American. The third conclusion is that Russian hackers used a whole variety of tools to get information and access from DNC, which is Democratic National Convention servers, and personal email accounts from DNC staff members. They did traditional hacks, they did software like SQL injections, if I'm not mistaken, they did spear phishing campaigns, they did old school manipulation pretending to be a member of the staff or something, and they also unsuccessfully tried to hack voting machine manufacturers and voting machine software companies. Thankfully, those did not go through, but attempts were made. They also attempted to hack several county offices and individuals that worked for counties who were responsible for counting votes or overseeing vote counting. In this time, the information that was obtained through Russian hacking was released through DC Leaks and Guccifer 2.0. These were actually Russian agencies or hacking teams that sort of created an alternative American alter ego that was similar to WikiLeaks that would just release this information in big dumps to the press. They chose to target Clinton in order to weaken her position against Trump, not only because they didn't like her stances on Russia, but because they wanted a closer and more contentious election in the United States. Russian agents leaked information that they obtained via hacking at critical times to downplay any bad news that the Trump campaign ran into. So anytime the Trump campaign was having a particularly bad day, such as the grab her by the pussy incident, they would release significantly more damaging information about Clinton. They also used, and by they I mean Russians, used WikiLeaks as a means to distribute information, and interestingly, WikiLeaks did have some contacts inside the Trump campaign, and there were some conversations that were had that maybe indicated the president would have known where this information came from and when it was coming ahead of time so that they could plan strategies around it. Which leads me to the next section of part 1. It's odd that part 1 in itself has a part 1 and 2, and this section is on Trump campaign and Russian collusion, which is the next 150 pages or so of the report. Briefly, we won't be using the word collusion very much because collusion isn't a crime. Collusion also isn't a legal word or precedent. There could be a lot of collusion or no collusion, and it's the same legally. Well, at least for this case, it's a little different if we're talking business monopolies or oligopolies. And even the report itself has a significant section on discussing the fact that collusion is not a chargeable offense nor a crime. And they spend a fair amount of time talking about conspiracy against the United States, which actually is a crime, and they lay out how conspiracy laws work, how they're structured, and the merits of pressing a conspiracy case. So at this point in investigating the Russian interference in the 2016 election, the team turned up possible links between Trump campaign members and Russian agents, ambassadors, or just some suspicious information sharing. So the Mueller team decided to also investigate the Trump campaign. However, they did not investigate candidate Trump personally. He was not a target of this investigation. There's a huge 150-page section on this that I'm going to try to summarize as best I can, but the factual conclusions about the Trump campaign Russia links are as follows. Number 1, the Trump Tower Moscow project. You may have heard that Donald Trump was engaging in investing and building a Trump Tower or hotel or real estate projects in Russia while campaigning, and a lot of people consider this to be a conflict of interest. Well, this one thankfully is really simple. During the campaign, Trump said that he had no Russian business links or deals, and when asked about the Trump Tower Moscow project, he also said that the deal had died a long time ago. Factually speaking, the Mueller team determined through numerous interviews and documents and paperwork and even some documents from Russia that the deal had in fact not died and continued up until May 2016, near the highest point of the campaign, and it eventually fizzled out near the end of the campaign. And however, this would mean that the deal was ongoing when the original statements were made that he had no Russian business or obligations whatsoever. This project was not illegal. And lying at this point was also not illegal. And also the project itself didn't appear to be pursued on a favor basis. Number 2, George Papadopolis. He was the campaign foreign policy advisor, and he attempted to set up meetings between Trump representatives and the Russian government several times, including some people claiming to be representatives or close to Vladimir Putin. The goal for these meetings was for Russians to have a good connection and/or backdoor channel to talk about their policy goals with the Trump campaign. One of these contacts suggested that the Russian government had dirt on Hillary Clinton and that they would be willing to share it with the Trump campaign. However, George Papadopoulos was never able to purchase or trade for said dirt, and he was not able to set up any meaningful meetings between Trump campaign members and Russian government ambassadors in any capacity. This isn't for lack of trying, though. George Papadopoulos did try to buy the dirt, did try to verify the dirt, trade for dirt, find bad information on Clinton, and set up meetings with Russians. However, none of it panned out, so this ultimately was not illegal. Next up, let's talk about Carter Page. He was another Trump campaign foreign policy advisor. This one's pretty straightforward too. Carter Page lived and worked abroad in Russia for a number of years. While he was there, he did some government work, government projects, but worked on them from the private sector, and he was approached by Russian intelligence. That we do know as a fact. However, it's factually unknown whether he joined any member of any Russian intelligence organization as a spy, agent, or freelancer. However, when joining the campaign, Carter Page listed one of his qualifications as having very close ties to Russia and close friends in the Kremlin that he could use to leverage good relationships with Russia. During his time with the campaign, he often worked to forward pro-Russian projects and Russian goals. The next section gets a little messy, but I'm going to try to summarize and move through in the most logical fashion possible. Jared Kushner, Jeff Sessions, and several other campaign members attended events hosted by Dmitry Sines of the CNI that also involved meeting the Russian ambassador to the United States at the time and involved a lot of policy talk. This was when Donald Trump was still a candidate for president and his staff were all campaign staff. This was before he had any legal authority to do negotiations with foreign countries. This was highly unusual, but not illegal to have these meetings. We'll talk about the one with Flynn later since that one is special. However, Jared Kushner kept in contact with Dmitry Sines even after the initial meetings kind of faltered out, and they talked about Russian foreign policy frequently. He would later give Jared a Russian foreign policy memo that Sines claimed to be written by the Russian government that was supposed to guide the Trump campaign to a pro-Russian solution for several of their problems. It was kind of unusual, and Jared did pass this on to the president, though it's unknown how much of it he read or implemented. Also, Dmitry promised dirt on candidate Clinton, which he actually did deliver several months later. The dirt in particular is included in the report, but is redacted under a big personal privacy banner, so I'm assuming it was something nasty. Oddly, Jared Kushner, upon receiving this information, considered it uninteresting and said it was old news. He did not like the dirt and was kind of unwilling to use it or trade for it or have any sort of cooperation going forward. Moving on to number 5 today, the infamous Trump Tower meeting with Donald Trump Jr. and Russians offering dirt on Hillary Clinton did occur. That was the factual conclusion of the Mueller investigation, that meeting definitely did occur, and it occurred because Russians offered some disparaging information against Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump Jr. was super excited about it. He wanted the dirt, and he said that his father would be pleased. Ultimately, the meeting turned into kind of a bait and switch, and it was like really low-grade dirt that they weren't interested in, and they talked about the Magnitsky Act a lot. In the report, interestingly, it talks about how Donald Trump Jr. was bored, it was a waste of his time, he played on his phone a lot, like they tried to get out of there, so it was kind of a bait and switch on that one, even though he was initially very excited about potentially getting some damaging information on Hillary Clinton. Number 6, let's talk about Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort was a Trump campaign advisor who was later, I believe, fired mid-campaign. He has been a lifelong lobbyist for dictators and warlords and shady governments in such places as Angola, Pakistan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Ukraine, and later the Russian government. During the campaign, when he was an advisor on the campaign, he and his subordinate, Rick Gates, had frequent talks with Russian government officials and unofficial representatives of oligarchs and unofficial representatives of Vladimir Putin. They often discussed Trump campaign strategies, shared polling data with Russians, and brought Russian suggestions back to the Trump campaign. And by suggestions, I don't mean how they campaign. What I mean more specifically is Russian policy suggestions. The policy suggestions primarily focused on how to deal with the Ukrainian situation in a way that was pro-Russian and would give Russia sort of a soft control over the region. Manafort got charged with probably more crimes than anybody in this investigation. I'm going to go ahead and read the brief summary of what Manafort was later charged with. The indictment against Manafort and Rick Gates charged them with engaging in a conspiracy against the United States, engaging in conspiracy to launder money, failing to file reports of foreign bank and financial accounts, and acting as unregistered agents of a foreign principal, making false and misleading statements and documents, and submitting false documents to the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and making false statements to the FBI. Prosecutors also claimed that Manafort laundered more than $18 million, money which he had received as compensation for lobbying and consulting services for pro-Russian former Ukrainian Prime Minister Viktor Yanukovych, which hopefully I'm saying correctly. He was also later charged with some real estate fraud in a state case. So out of all of this Russian conspiracy going on, why was the president not charged with conspiracy against the United States? Well, there are several reasons for this of varying complexity. First off, there was no provable cooperation between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. The Trump campaign never used dirt that the Russian government offered them on Hillary Clinton. They never bought dirt. They never traded or bartered for dirt. And also, the Russian government never asked anything of the campaign. And this is kind of a critical point. Typically for conspiracy, you're looking, and this is where the word collusion would show up, cooperation, where the Russian government will call and say, hey, if you do X, we'll do Y, and it'll be a great trade, and we do that. That never really happened. The Trump campaign never really gave anything to them, and the communication was very one way. They seemed to be just very happy to receive free help from the Russian government. Number 2 is that in the campaign finance law violation section, the thing of value that somebody in the campaign would have to be offered, and which they would have to receive as dirt on Hillary Clinton, was kind of difficult to ascertain a price on. The thing of value could easily be argued to be completely devoid of value or really high of value or ambiguous value, and would make for a poor legal case, and would probably be the Trump team's best defense against this. And finally, one element of crime that's necessary for conspiracy against the United States is willfulness to break the law. You have to willingly break the law, which means that you have to know the law. However, Mueller's team determined that none of the campaign staff, aside from Manafort and Gates, who were charged differently, knew about the law, specifically the complexities of registering as foreign agents and campaign finance law and all this kind of stuff. And they found that it would be difficult to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in court that members of the team were knowledgeable enough of the crimes that they were attempting to commit to be willful to committing a conspiracy crime. That's really complicated. Thus, no charges were filed against Trump himself and most of the members of the campaign on charges of conspiracy, except, of course, for Manafort and Gates. I have my own opinions on this, but I'm going to save that for much later in the video. Right now, we're focusing on factual results only. So, moving along, during the investigation, the president became very upset that the media was painting him as a Russian spy, as a Russian agent, as a traitor, as somebody that cooperated with Russia. It was a very unflattering portrait. He considered it detrimental to his command, publicly embarrassing, and personally embarrassing as well. As such, he took several actions to curtail the investigation that could be considered obstruction of justice. Ironically, during the entire time the Russian investigation was going on, the president was not a suspect at any point until he took some of these potentially obstructive actions. The special counsel was granted permission to investigate any obstruction of justice related to their original investigation as well. This is kind of a standard clause and standard thing that allows you to investigate people that lie to the FBI or tamper with your witnesses. And some of the president's actions and actions of his staff were considered to be obstructive by the Mueller team, thus the investigation broadened to include obstruction of justice. As a side note, before I get into the details, I want to talk about on the legality of obstruction of justice real quick, in that you can still obstruct justice even if you are innocent. If you are 100% innocent and guiltless and have never committed a sin or crime in your life, or if the pretenses of the investigation are false, you can still commit a crime by trying to obstruct that information. Essentially, the state views it as justice is being sought to determine innocence or guilt, and any means of stopping that process is a crime. This is sort of attorney's version of resisting arrest. Even if you're completely innocent, if you just act suspicious and run from police, you can be arrested for that in and of itself. Also, even though it's rare, committing an act in public, such as tweets, which we will discuss later, can be considered obstructive as well, and it's rare because typically people that obstruct justice know that it's a crime or want to hide it, so it's done privately. So, factual results of the obstruction investigation. Number 1, several members of the Trump campaign team and then later presidential staff lied to investigators about several issues, but mostly in regards to their interactions with Russians, Russian agents, and Russian ambassadors. This is in and of itself an obstructive act. You cannot lie to investigators. However, it applies to the president only if the president directed them to lie to investigators. And the president's direction in this case is debatable for some members, unlikely for some, and more factual for others, such as perhaps Cohen. Interestingly, the president did direct people to lie numerous times to investigators, and they refused. Thus, no crime was committed. So the president told somebody to tell a lie. They didn't, and that's oddly not obstruction. Number 2, moving along. Even though U.S. intelligence agencies agreed that Russians did interfere with our elections, the president did not. He was publicly and privately very critical of this conclusion and tried to brush it off or downplay it and say that Russians didn't significantly impact or hack or have a whole lot to do with the 2016 elections. Privately, he expressed concerns to members of his staff that the general public believing that he won thanks to the help of Russia would illegitimize his victory and serve to delay policy goals. So, soon after taking office, the president called the heads of the CIA, NSA, and FBI and asked them to hold press conferences or make written public statements saying that the president was not a suspect in the Russia investigation. The leaders of these organizations found the request to be extremely unusual and declined to do so, thus no crime was committed by any of them. So let's talk about Michael Flynn. This is one of the big ones in the obstruction section. Michael Flynn was charged with a crime of being, I believe it was, an unregistered agent of a foreign government and lying to investigators because right after the Obama administration began the Russia investigation and sanctioned Russians punitively for their interference in the 2016 election, Russia was considering counter-sanctions and other punitive measures. Michael Flynn reached out to the Russian ambassador and several other Russians on behalf of the Trump campaign team and asked them to not do these sanctions and not do these measures so that hopefully in the future, when Trump took power, that Trump and the Russian government could have a very friendly relationship with no bad footing to start with. This was illegal. He also lied to investigators about these meetings as well, which was more illegal.
The
Department of Justice informed the president and his staff that they caught Flynn lying before the president took office, but the president decided to ignore their recommendations, and they kept Flynn on staff anyway. When the media picked up the story, the president fired Michael Flynn, thinking that this would end the Russia investigation. However, they continued investigating, and they continued investigating Flynn. Later, he asked FBI Director James Comey to let Flynn go, to drop the Flynn thing, drop the Russia thing, and continually asked Comey to just kind of let this go. This could be an obstructive act if it were followed through on. However, Comey never did this. During the time, the president also attempted to have staff members create letters, memos, and statements denying that they knew about Flynn's meetings with Russians, and the staff largely declined to create these letters or memos at the president's request. The reason is they said they didn't know if the president knew or not, and they didn't really know either, so they didn't want to make memos or statements about things that they didn't know or understand. Staff members seem to agree that this request to possibly make false memos could be obstructive, and they collectively agreed to forget that it ever happened and move on with their lives pretending that it didn't exist. So now that complicated story is done, let's talk about James Comey, director of the FBI. The president had several meetings with Comey, asking him to either end or limit the Russian investigation in several ways. Each time that they had a meeting, Comey either refused the president or gave non-committal answers. Later, the president would have private meetings with Comey requesting his loyalty and offering him jobs such as, do you like your current role at the FBI? Would you like to continue at the FBI? These were sort of indirect and backhanded ways to tell him that he could keep his job if he dropped the Russia thing. Comey found this unusual and decided to document each meeting with the president with memos, which he kept in a safe because he assumed that he would need them later. Comey also assumed that given the unusual, private, and sort of direct nature of these meetings, that these were offers to him, compensations. Eventually, the president grew tired of Comey not following his instructions and had several discussions with his staff about firing Comey. Most of the discussions about firing Comey involved ending the Russia investigation and/or Comey's disloyalty to Trump for not following his directions to end the investigation to begin with. The staff, this is the president's staff, all agreed that it was a bad idea to fire Comey and that it wouldn't end the investigation. The president disagreed and went through with it anyway. Comey was therefore fired. This is largely considered to be the biggest and most important obstructive act because the president made this act to potentially curtail investigations into himself and his staff. Oddly, after firing Comey, the president boasted at a press conference that 80% of the FBI was happy to have him gone and that the public's faith in the FBI would be restored, which was just kind of strange. Number 5 in this section, Jeff Sessions' recusal. Attorney General Jeff Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigation because he had met with several Russians during the campaign. He knew that he was a suspect in the investigation in Russian conspiracy, and as per Department of Justice guidelines, it would be unethical for him to head the organization responsible for an investigation into himself. So he decided to recuse from this specific investigation because that was the ethical thing to do as per DOJ guidelines. The report states from a number of witnesses that the president was extremely angry about this. He reportedly stated numerous times that Jeff Sessions' job was to protect the president, referencing Bobby Kennedy protecting Jack, and on a number of occasions he demanded Sessions to unrecuse himself and end the investigation. Each time the president made the demand that Sessions unrecuse himself, Sessions declined, stating Department of Justice policy and ethics guidelines. Eventually, the president demanded his resignation, which Sessions delivered his resignation. Upon delivering the resignation, the president declined to accept the resignation and pocketed the letter, then asking Sessions to stay on board. Several staff members felt that this was unusual and could be later used for blackmail or pressure against Sessions, or if for any reason a foreign government would come into contact with that letter, it could be very compromising for the authority of the administration in general. So several of the president's staff members attempted to steal the letter back several times and destroy it, but were unsuccessful. And I'm smiling a little bit because I wish that I was making this up, but I wasn't, but I'm not. That's literally what the report says. Number 6 in this section, there's a very long section about each individual time the president wanted to have the special counsel removed, requested his removal, instructed staff members to fire the special counsel, or fire different staff members, or make requests of the Department of Justice to limit or curtail the investigation. This goes on for quite some time. And essentially, at each step along the way, the staff member that he instructed to do this refused the request or passed it on down to a subordinate who also refused the request. Most of the time, the staff members said that they didn't feel comfortable doing it or that it felt unethical, and some of them even threatened to resign if they were asked to do it again. Number 7, finally, and perhaps more importantly, because it's the most clear of anything in the entire report, there's a section on witness tampering. The report believes that the president attempted to influence several witnesses into not cooperating with the FBI. More specifically, these would be Manafort, Flynn, and Cohen. All of these attempts to influence witnesses followed a similar pattern. It started with public praise and private offers of support, and the Trump organization paying all of their legal fees in a joint defense agreement. However, if that person cooperated with the FBI, the Trump organization would stop paying legal fees, then the public praise would be retracted and replaced with extremely harsh criticism, and sometimes, such in the case of Cohen's family, vague threats. Privately, messages were often relayed through an attorney that the president was either pleased, displeased, supported, or did not support actions of several people that were under investigation, depending on what their choices were. The Mueller team considers these to be obstructive acts because they attempt to influence a witness to not cooperate to the FBI or to lie to the FBI. Several of them did lie to the FBI because of these things. This could also be considered threats against a witness, and the president's ability to influence mass media can cause criticism to turn into very real threats from other parties. And finally, because of the president's extreme ability to influence mass media and get messages out to the public in a very direct manner, it potentially pollutes the jury pool both before and during any trial, because it'll be difficult to find jurors that don't have some knowledge of what's going on or haven't seen the president's tweets, and it would be difficult to shelter jurors from additional outside information during a trial because it's what the president is talking about. So at the end of all of these potentially obstructive acts, the Mueller team decided not to provide a standard prosecutorial decision, and they made it very clear that even though they chose not to recommend charges, that this report was not an exoneration of the president's actions. So why is that? Doesn't that seem a bit odd that they would write that, well, we're not saying he's guilty, but we're not saying he's innocent? That's a little bit strange, but the reason is because several difficult legal and constitutional statutes came up. Firstly, a sitting president cannot be indicted. This is just a legal fact in the United States. If you are a sitting president, you are unindictable for any crime that I'm aware of, even if you eat babies for lunch. On top of this, Mueller found that it would be unethical to accuse the president of a crime, which he then could not be indicted for, and then could not go to court to defend himself for several years to come. Mueller felt that accusing the president of a crime while not recommending an indictment would make the president guilty in the court of public opinion without any opportunity for him to prove his innocence, and would weaken his leadership role, which Mueller found unethical. Secondly, there are numerous very complex constitutional arguments to if a president can even obstruct justice. A lot of these that I read in the report come from the president's lawyers and were considered from the Mueller team and written into the report. But the president's lawyers largely argue that he cannot obstruct justice because he is justice. The president is in charge of the executive branch and the Department of Justice and the administration of justice, and it is at his discretion to hire and fire FBI directors, to direct investigations, to grant pardons, to do a lot of things regarding justice, and this is his constitutional mandate. So, as such, anything that the president does could not obstruct justice because he is justice. Now, the Mueller team disagreed with this. They felt that the president could be charged with obstruction for justice if he used his office or his official capacity for personal gains or to obstruct a case into himself. However, the Mueller team did agree with the president's lawyers that it is a complex issue and that it would likely be an issue for the Supreme Court to decide, because as of right now, there's no legal precedent on this matter. Something like this has never happened before, so there's no legal precedent, as settled by a high court, that is, that a president can obstruct justice. So they expected a Supreme Court battle, which is lengthy. And thirdly, there were occasional gaps of information in the report where Mueller and his team were unable to draw conclusions. Several of the Russian people mentioned went to Russia and they are not extradited. Several people lied to the FBI and were considered not credible witnesses. There were credible witnesses that gave conflicting reports, documents that were destroyed, private servers that were wiped. The number of the president's staff and campaign members use encrypted messaging services, which the FBI was not able to access. So in these gaps of evidence, there's no ability to charge people for a crime. There's also oftentimes an inability to establish a motive, and sometimes it's hard to tell if the president's motive was administrative or personal, which makes for a very good legal defense in court. Lastly, because of the difficult and often long process of charging a president with a crime, Mueller felt that it would harm the president's ability to fulfill his constitutional duties. So that's the end of the factual findings of the report. I did that in just under 40 minutes, which to me seems crazy considering how long that was. But now I want to offer you my personal opinions on the matter, having read the whole thing and summarized it for you here. And I'm going to offer one opinion about each section. So number one, Russia definitely messed with our elections big time. They did a huge social media disinformation campaign, which worked brilliantly, and they hacked us, so that's not very good. Their goals seem to have been to sow as much discord as possible in the US to make whoever won the election seem less legitimate. However, they did seem to shift to pro-Trump as the campaign went on. He was definitely their favorite candidate. Number two, candidate Trump probably did not commit a collusion or conspiracy type crime. However, some of his staff did, and numerous members of his staff expressed interest in committing this crime, but didn't for technical reasons or for reasons such as that they didn't value the Clinton dirt that was given them. This behavior is not illegal, thus no crimes were charged. However, it's grossly unethical by just about any standard that you want to apply to it. Number three, the president most likely did obstruct justice several times and attempted to obstruct justice several more times. The most notable ones were firing Comey and witness tampering. If he were not president, and this were, say, a governor or a senator, he would 100% be charged with obstruction in a federal court. The complex legal and constitutional considerations of this matter, given that the president is above the Department of Justice and he oversees that, make it unlikely for him to be indicted or for crimes to be, or charges to be brought against him. I also suspect that the non-traditional decision by the Mueller team was sort of a congressional call for impeachment and to lay the groundwork for impeachment if Congress decided that that was appropriate. Okay. That was a really long video and it was really complex. I hope that you stuck with it the entire way, and I hope that you learned something useful today. And more than anything, I hope you download that report and read it yourself. If you enjoyed this kind of analytical content, either for politics or philosophy or gaming, you could subscribe. Drifter out.